A story of silence. But listen closely. Connecting minds. Connecting from Africa for the world.
This morning, they didn't wake up to breakfast in a five-star hotel. They woke up to armed officers banging on the door. Within an hour, the most powerful foreign mining bosses in this country were in handcuffs, dragged out of suites, shoved into police trucks, still in their pajamas. These guys have been making billions off our gold for years. Meanwhile, people here barely see a cent of it. They thought they were untouchable. Not today. The arrests are shaking up the mining industry. And you can bet foreign governments are freaking out right now. So, what the hell happened? Let's break it down. Here's the thing. This didn't just drop out of the sky. This has been years in the making. For more than half a century, this country's gold mines have been a gold rush for everyone except the people who actually live here. Foreign companies moved in, set up massive operations, and signed contracts that looked good on paper, but were a disaster in reality. Let's talk numbers, because they are ugly. According to the Ministry of Natural Resources, in just the past 20 years, foreign mining companies have extracted over $480 billion worth of gold. Now you'd expect a chunk of that to go back into the country, right? Wrong. Only around $9.7 billion ever made it into the national treasury. That's barely 2% of the total value. The rest? Gone. Laundered through offshore accounts in places like the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Reinvested in luxury properties in Paris, London, and Dubai. Poured into political lobbying abroad to keep the system exactly as it was. Meanwhile, mining towns here are still running on diesel generators and digging wells by hand. In some areas, more than 60% of households have no access to clean drinking water. Schools run on volunteer teachers making less than $100 a month, while a single day of gold exports can be worth $50 million. And this didn't happen by accident. There's documented proof of sweetheart deals that slashed corporate tax rates from 30% down to as low as 3% in some cases. In 2015, a leaked memo showed a former minister accepting a $50 million bribe in exchange for rewriting mining regulations. The new rules allowed companies to underreport their production without facing penalties. Foreign executives knew exactly what they were doing. Internal emails later obtained by investigators showed them referring to locals as cheap labor and the government as easy to buy. This wasn't business. This was extraction with zero accountability. And here's where it gets even more interesting, because the world was watching, but no one said a thing. International watchdog groups published reports, but they barely made headlines. Western governments stayed quiet. Why? Because their investors were making a fortune. Now, fast forward to last year, rumors started about an internal audit. No official announcement, no press coverage. But people noticed unmarked vehicles near mine sites, drones flying over restricted areas, and satellite images being pulled from commercial providers in Europe. It wasn't random. It was a silent buildup to something big. And I want to hear your take. If you knew your government was secretly tracking every ounce of gold leaving the country, would you call that smart strategy or political suicide? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you're all for transparency, hit that like button so more people see what's going on here. You could feel it coming, but no one expected it to drop this hard. At 5:45 a.m. last Tuesday, the capital's streets were still quiet. By 6 at dawn, it was chaos in every five-star hotel across the city. Special forces had orders, hit 7 locations at the same time. The targets, the CEOs of the biggest foreign mining companies operating here. Victor Petro from Goldmax Corporation, Jean-Claude Dubois from Western Gold Mining, Michael Thompson from Pacific Resources. These weren't random arrests. Every name was on a list months in the making. By 6:12 a.m., Petro was in handcuffs, pulled straight from his penthouse suite. Dubois was intercepted on his way to the airport, his private jet already fueled and waiting. Thompson, caught in a hotel conference room trying to wire funds out of the country. Every move, every escape plan, they saw it coming. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment raid. Documents later revealed that for 6 months, intelligence teams had been tracking phone calls, monitoring financial transactions, and even planting informants inside corporate offices. They'd mapped out not just the executives' schedules, but their habits, right down to what time they ordered room service. And here's the part that rattled the industry. Within minutes of the arrests, all foreign mining accounts in local banks were frozen. Every gold shipment scheduled for export that day was halted at the border. Trucks loaded with ore were rerouted under armed escort to secure government storage. The news broke before sunrise, and by the time markets opened in London, Toronto, and Sydney, the stocks of these companies were already tanking, some losing over 30% in value within hours. Investors overseas were scrambling. Phone lines between here and European capitals lit up with urgent calls. Now imagine you're a shareholder waking up to see a third of your investment gone overnight. Would you panic sell or hold and hope for a miracle? Tell me in the comments. And if you think this was a long overdue move, well, but you must share this story. Let's see how far it can go. Here's where the quiet buildup turns into something explosive. Long before the dawn raids, the government had quietly assembled a team, half local investigators, half international experts in finance, criminal law, and resource management. On paper, they were reviewing mining permits. In reality, they were building a case. One investigator told me off camera, "We treated it like a crime scene. Every invoice, every shipment record, every satellite image was evidence." They pulled 10 years of financial statements from every foreign mining company operating here. Forensic accountants combed through line by line, flagging anything that didn't add up. And the patterns, they were impossible to ignore. One company reported exporting 1 ton of gold a month. Satellite and drone imagery showed the mine producing closer to 10 tons. 9 out of every 10 bars were simply missing from the books. Then came the smoking gun. Encrypted emails between executives discussing off-ledger shipments and how to disguise them using fake invoices. In one exchange, a CEO bragged about selling gold worth $60,000 a bar on paper for just $10,000. The difference quietly pocketed in offshore accounts. It wasn't just theft, it was systemic fraud on a scale that bled the country dry. And it went beyond money. One leaked memo from Pacific Resources openly approved the dumping of cyanide waste into a river system, knowing it would poison nearby villages. Official health data later confirmed cancer rates in those areas were 10 times higher than the national average. International reaction? Mostly silence. A few headlines in smaller outlets, but major Western networks stayed quiet. Why? Because many of the same companies under investigation had deep ties to their own governments. A US-based analyst told me bluntly, "These aren't just corporations. They're political donors, campaign backers, and in some cases, former government officials themselves." By the time the evidence was compiled, the file was thick enough to land with a thud when dropped on a desk. Every page was a nail in the coffin. And the people in charge knew, the moment this went public, there was no going back. "Either we act now or we admit we're part of the problem," one official told me. They chose to act. And here's something I want you to think about. If your country had proof, solid, irrefutable proof, that billions were stolen and your people were poisoned in the process, would you risk the backlash from the world's most powerful nations to bring justice? That's exactly the gamble they took. This wasn't just any court case. For the first time, the country set up a special tribunal. 7 judges from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. No Western representatives, no corporate lobbyists, no backroom deals. On day 1, the lead prosecutor stepped forward with a stack of files thick enough to block the view of the defense table. He read the charges, one by one. Victor Petro of Goldmax, 234 counts, including tax evasion, bribery, illegal land seizures, and environmental destruction. Jean-Claude Dubois of Western Gold Mining, 189 counts, the most damning, using child labor in underground mines. Michael Thompson of Pacific Resources, life-endangering environmental crimes that left thousands sick. When the victims spoke, the courtroom fell silent. First was Musa Orurugo. He started working in the mines at age 8. Now 23, his voice shook as he said, "They stole my childhood, my health, my future." Next was Miriam Cow, a 70-year-old woman whose village was bulldozed for mining land. "They gave us $100, she whispered, and took everything else." It was no longer about contracts or production numbers. It was about people, faces, families, lives. Every testimony hit harder than the last. Think about that for a second. If this happened in your hometown, how much would justice be worth to you? Would a $1 billion fine feel enough, or would you want more? Drop your thoughts below. I'm curious where you stand. The verdict came 6 months later, but when it did, it shook the world. Guilty, every single one. Petro, 50 years in prison plus a $10 billion fine to us. Dubois, 45 years, 80 billion. Thompson, life without parole. Others got between 40 and 60 years depending on the charges. And here's the twist nobody saw coming. The court didn't just sentence them, they seized everything. Yachts, mansions, offshore accounts, even luxury art collections. Proceeds from the sales, not to the government, not to corporations, but directly to the victims' families. The day after the verdict, the country woke up different. This time, it wasn't just headlines. It was real visible change. By sunrise, armed security stood at the gates of every major mining site. The logos of Goldmax, Western Gold, and Pacific Resources were gone, replaced by a simple sign: property of the people. Government auditors arrived with clipboards and scanners, cataloging every piece of machinery, every ounce of gold in storage. Bank officials confirmed over 7.4 billion in liquid assets had been seized from corporate accounts within the first 48 hours. That was just the beginning. Luxury properties, private planes, high-end vehicles, everything was sold off in rapid-fire auctions. By the end of the month, more than 12.6 billion had been transferred directly to a victim compensation fund. And here's where it hit home. In a mining village in the South, families received their first payments, some as much as $50,000. For a community where the average yearly income was under $600, it was life-changing. A 65-year-old miner named Amadou held up the check on camera. Tears in his eyes. This is not charity. This is what was stolen from us. But the government didn't stop at payouts. They launched the National Mining Company, state-owned, with 70% of revenue legally bound to public services. Within 3 months, 118 new schools broke ground. 47 hospitals began construction. 1,300 kilometers of roads were already being paved. Over 500 water wells were drilled in rural areas that had gone dry for decades. Wages in the mining sector jumped from an average of $50 to $500 a month. Child labor? Gone. Completely outlawed, with teams inspecting sites weekly. Accidents dropped to zero under new safety protocols. And the results were visible fast. In one town, children who used to work in the mines were now wearing uniforms, walking to brand new classrooms. Local clinics stocked medicines for the first time in years. Electricity reached villages that had been in the dark since the day they were founded. The international reaction was immediate and mixed. Some African nations praised the bold move and started looking at their own mining contracts. But in Europe and North America, headlines called it economic nationalism and warned it would scare off investors. The markets didn't wait to pass judgment. Shares of Goldmax collapsed by 72% in 3 weeks. Now, I want your take. If you were running another resource-rich country and saw these results, would you copy this model or play it safe to keep foreign investors happy? Drop your opinion below, and if you think more nations should take this leap, share this story so it reaches the people who need to hear it. Here's where the story stopped being just one country's news and became a continental earthquake. Within days of the verdict, leaders from Mali, Guinea, and Niger made public statements hinting at a full review of foreign mining contracts. A week later, Mali's president announced the suspension of 4 major gold export licenses pending investigation. In Guinea, the government moved to nationalize bauxite mines worth billions annually. Niger tore up 2 uranium mining agreements that had been in place for over 30 years. It wasn't just talk. In Bamako, Malian special forces raided the headquarters of a foreign mining firm accused of tax fraud. In Conakry, Guinea's parliament passed a law requiring 80% of mining profits to stay in country. In Niamey, Niger's energy minister went on national TV to say, "We've been sleeping for too long. We're awake now." Foreign capitals scrambled to respond. Paris called the moves reckless resource nationalism. London warned of irreversible economic damage. In Washington, one senator told Bloomberg, "If this spreads, Western access to African resources will face its biggest challenge in decades. The markets reflected the panic. Gold max stock was already down over 70%. Western gold mining lost $3.2 billion in market value in a single trading session. Pacific Resources shut down all operations across Africa within 2 months, citing unfavorable conditions. But here's the other side of the coin. Ordinary people across Africa were watching, and many were inspired. Social media hashtags like #OurGoldOurFuture and #Africa4Africans trended in multiple countries. Videos of the arrests, the verdict, and the first payouts went viral, racking up millions of views. And that raises the question, if you were in charge of a resource-rich African nation right now, would you ride this wave and take control? Or would you hold back, fearing backlash from powerful countries? Let me know in the comments, because this debate is already shaping the next chapter of African politics. This wasn't just about putting a few CEOs behind bars. From day one, the leadership here made it clear. They see this as the start of a long game. The National Mining Company's first annual report lays it out. Within 5 years, they aim to process 100% of gold domestically before export. That means more jobs in refining, manufacturing, and logistics, industries that have barely existed here until now. Soon, scholarships are already rolling out for 10,000 students in engineering, geology, and environmental science. Fully funded, no repayment. Technical universities are being built in every major mining region so young people can train close to home instead of leaving for the capital or overseas. But here's where it gets more ambitious. The plan isn't just to control gold. There's talk of applying the same model to manganese, copper, even lithium. If successful, it could flip the continent's role in the global supply chain, from raw materials supplier to finished product exporter. Of course, that's the dream. The reality? It's going to put them on a collision course with the same powerful nations and corporations they just challenged. Some economists warn about sanctions, trade barriers, even covert destabilization efforts. Others argue the momentum is unstoppable. Once people taste the benefits, it's hard to take them back. And it's not without precedent. Think of how Norway built its sovereign wealth fund from oil revenues, or how Botswana turned diamond profits into infrastructure and education. Those examples work because of long-term planning and public accountability. The question is, can that model hold here in a region where political shifts can be sudden and sharp? If you were advising the government right now, would you push for rapid expansion of this resource control model? Or would you focus on protecting what's already been won? Tell me in the comments, because the choices they make in the next few years will decide whether this becomes a success story or a cautionary tale. 6 months ago, this was unthinkable. Today, it's a reality the world can't ignore. A country that was once written off as powerless stood up to billion-dollar corporations and won legally, publicly, and without apology. Gold that used to vanish overseas is now building schools, hospitals, and roads right here. Children who once worked in the mines now walk to class in clean uniforms. Families who buried loved ones from mining accidents or poisoned water now have compensation and a voice. But this story isn't wrapped up with a neat bow. The same forces that built the old system haven't disappeared. They're watching, waiting, and planning their next move. The real test isn't in the arrests or even the verdicts. It's in whether the people and the leaders they choose can keep this momentum alive 5, 10, 20 years from now. This is bigger than one country. Across Africa, across the global south, others are watching. Some are inspired, some are afraid, and some, well, they're hoping this whole thing fails so business can go back to normal. But if there's one thing this past year has proven, it's that normal isn't inevitable. Change is messy, it's risky, but sometimes it's exactly what's needed. So here's my final question for you. Do you believe this is the start of a new chapter for resource-rich nations? Or is it just a moment in the news cycle that will fade like so many before it? Tell me where you stand in the comments. And if you believe in justice, dignity, and a fair share for the people who own the land, share this story, because the more people know, the harder it is to ignore.